Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2021 UN South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. This is the session titled Universal and Equitable Access to COVID-19 Vaccines. I'm Adarsh from Q Design, and I will be your technical facilitator today. Both the chat function and the Q&A function will be on. So if you have any questions for the speakers at any point, please use the Q&A function. Please note that this session today will be recorded. If you have any questions about Zoom or require technical assistance, please feel free to privately message me, Adarsh, for help using the chat box. I will now hand over to Aruna to start the session.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our panel discussion, Not Charity, but Rights, Universal and Equitable Access to COVID-19 Vaccines. The panel discussion today will focus and explore one central theme, which is how do we ensure that everybody everywhere has access to a vaccine as quickly as possible in a way that is affordable and made freely available to those in need. And this panel discussion has been brought to you in collaboration with the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, the South Center, as well as Human Rights Watch, and a special shout out and a big thank you to the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights for providing us this platform. I'm Aruna Kashyap, and I have the privilege and honor of moderating this panel discussion. And with me today are some extremely seasoned experts who are at the forefront of some of the most important debates globally in ensuring and trying to see what are the policy changes globally needed, as well as other reforms that are urgently required now to make sure that vaccines are widely available and brought to everybody's doorstep as quickly as possible in an affordable way. Now, I want to move on to quickly introducing our wonderful panelists. So please join me in welcoming first, Viviana Munoz-Tellez, the coordinator of the Health, Intellectual Property and Biodiversity Program at the South Center. Next on our panel, we have His Excellency Brajendra Navneet, India's ambassador and permanent representative to the World Trade Organization in Geneva. Dr. Mariangela Simao, who is the Assistant Director General of Access to Medicines and Health Products at the World Health Organization. And Mr. Abdul Muqtadir, Chairman of Incepta Pharmaceuticals in Bangladesh, who's a Bangladeshi pharmaceutical company that can manufacture COVID-19 vaccines. Now, a huge thank you for all of our panelists for taking the time. We know you have an extremely busy schedule and really looking forward to a very rich discussion about some ways forward. Now, before I start to kick off this discussion, I do want to take some time, a couple of minutes, to set the stage and throw out some rather bleak statistics. Now, we are 1 year into the pandemic. Since the WHO declared COVID-19 a pandemic, over 2.6 million people have died. There is tremendous distress all over the world, and people are growing really, really tired of this pandemic. Everybody's desperate to get a vaccine. The good news is that there are safe and effective vaccines out there, developed with, by superb sort of breakneck speed, with tremendous investment of public money from some high-income governments, and that's good news. Now, the bad news is that, we are in huge, despite the speed at which R&D has occurred, there is a huge mismatch of supply and demand. The demand far outstrips the supply today. There are 326 million vaccines that have been distributed across the world, but a vast majority of them have only gone to a handful of countries. And the gulf between the vaccine have-nots and the vaccine haves is so huge and so distressing and concerning that it is the most pressing debate now when you talk about vaccines. Not only is the gulf so huge between countries, the gulf even within countries is large because of the extreme short supply available to very many countries. They have to introduce a system of rationing. And that is the problem. And the theme of today is how do we ration less and how do we get to more supply, making sure everybody everywhere has access to a vaccine. Now, in terms of the overall sort of disparity, on the one hand, for example, we have the US government that has announced that by May, for example, they aim to make the vaccine available to all adults within the US. Whereas on the other hand, we have governments, a lot of low-income governments that do not have access to a vaccine, not even a single vaccine that can go to health workers at the front line of this, providing care to COVID patients. So that's the kind of disparity we are talking about. And so at the heart of this debate is, what is a human rights approach? If we do say that everybody everywhere has a right to get a vaccine, and we're talking about a human right to a vaccine, we know states have obligations to protect people's rights to life, health, and a decent standard of life, or an adequate standard of living. This obligation states have towards their own people in countries individually, but there is also a larger obligation, an obligation for international cooperation and assistance, where states should help each other, and states should also help share the benefits of scientific research and its application. And so there's one individual aspect in a collaborative, cooperative approach to discharging obligations. The second aspect of states' obligations is that we need to ensure that no state interferes with another state's ability to discharge its obligations. So if one government wants to expand vaccine manufacturing by using whatever measures possible within country to expand manufacturing, no other country should be able to interfere, either using trade-based retaliation or intimidation or any other measure to interfere with the government's discharge of its human rights obligations. Simultaneously, the pharmaceutical industry plays a really important role, and the pharmaceutical and the pharma companies also have human rights responsibilities to help and support governments to make sure that vaccine access is made, as widely, quickly available, as well as affordable, and wherever governments are able to make it free for those in need. Now, with this in mind, I also want to reiterate that these human rights obligations, none of these things are new. They've been repeatedly reiterated by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, through the statements, through a guidance that's been issued, as well as a joint statement made by various special procedures of the UN, including the Special Rapporteur on Right to Health, as well as the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. So that's the framework within which today's debates will happen. Now, at the heart of this, given the disparity, one of the most pressing global debates is around a proposal that's been initially put forward by India and South Africa, and now it's been co-sponsored by totally over 60 countries at the World Trade Organization, specifically looking for some specific provisions of the global treaty governing trade and intellectual property rights to be suspended temporarily, to allow the policy space for all governments to pursue whatever measures needed to make vaccines available. Now, with that as the global setting and the stage at which we're convening this discussion, I'm now going to turn over to Viviana with our first question. Viviana, I mean, the gulf between the vaccine have-nots and vaccine haves is huge. And your organization has been among one of the several at the forefront of this debate to try to bridge this gap. Now, what, according to you, are some of the constraints that are really sort of hindering supply of vaccines, and what can we do to speed it up, and what are the ways forward?
Thank you, Aruna. And as South Center, just to say that we're also very happy to be co-sponsoring this event with such great speakers. So first of all, I think it's important to highlight that we are in a pandemic situation, which means that this is clearly a global problem. That means that the approach that has to be taken in order to resolve the pandemic is really to take a global approach. So the goal must be really clear, is that we need the COVID-19 vaccines to be treated as global public goods. And what that means is that they should be accessible to all countries equally, but unfortunately, as has been mentioned, for the moment, that is not the case. So we have limited supply, therefore we need to focus on increasing supply. We also need to focus the efforts towards more fair and equitable allocation of existing vaccines. And importantly, what was considered within the what would be an equitable allocation framework was to first have at least 20% of the population in all countries around the world to have adequate access to COVID-19 vaccines before addressing the rest of the population. So that's where we come from. Now, what can we do then to address some of the key constraints right now to expanding vaccine access? Well, one of the issues is addressing the concentration of production with few companies around the world. Now, one of the reasons that we are in this status is because we have proprietary technology associated to these COVID-19 vaccines. So few countries are controlling general supply. These vaccines have been developed with significant amounts of public and nonprofit funding. Some studies, for example, recently Waters and all in the Lancet mention at least $9 billion on funding. Therefore, this has not just been a private innovation initiative coming from the companies, but nonetheless, they are exercising legal barriers in the form of intellectual property rights of patents, trade secrets, and other exclusive rights. And therefore, they are controlling which are those partners, for example, that they're allowing contract manufacturing to take place or not. We have seen so far a limited transfer of technology and know-how, which is really critical for vaccine production. And we have generally this gap in having a mechanism to ensure that there is access to the technologies. Now, we can't rely on voluntary licensing, which is simply a form of the companies deciding by themselves the conditions for agreements, and in particular focusing on manufacturing contracting. So to redress this, we really need states to be using their existing mechanisms through the TRIPS agreements on intellectual property, but that won't be sufficient. And that's why we do fully support the proposal for the waiver of these legal obligations for the moments of the pandemic. Now, the other big issue is that vaccines are not being produced at scale. There's insufficient efforts to use the existing global capacity for production and manufacturing. There's also a significant variance in the pricing for vaccines. So as we move forward, there is an important concern on affordability, whether that can limit access, particularly for low and middle income countries. And we see variations between values of $37 to about $3 per dose, and also variations for the same vaccine and pricing depending on countries. So this is a big question in the future also, when we see there might be a need for the boosters. In the post-pandemic scenario, pharmaceutical firms, vaccine producers are not ensuring the same prices at the moment. So affordability should still be borne in mind. Now, there's also the issue of lack of equitable allocation of vaccine supply that exists so far. And this is largely due to the state's Me Too approach. A few of the more rich countries that have decided to take a nationalistic approach first, ensuring that they have large number of vaccine doses for their populations. And this then puts significant pressure on the global efforts to try to ensure fair and equitable vaccine allocation. At the same time, we also seen some trade restrictions in the form of either export restrictions, and now we're seeing also pressures with regards to availability of raw materials for production of vaccines. This is also related to some of these state policies that is emphasizing on production for their domestic supply. Now, related to this, we have an issue of lack of transparency and insufficient coordination. Transparency in many sense, including in agreements between those states and companies for which they are directly procuring vaccines, also among companies and their choice for partners for producing those vaccines. We also have this issue even within the COVAX facility with regards to the contracts with manufacturers. And this is also being reflected now in also those supply chain shortages that are taking place, where we also need to enhance much more coordination between company efforts and state efforts. So I don't want to expand myself further, but just to mention that some of the issues that we really need to do is for states to really take this active role in driving company actions more towards where we want to see vaccines as global public goods. And this, they have sufficient mechanisms to do so. Of course, the waiver of the TRIPS agreement is one of these important mechanisms to do so, as other mechanisms we'll hear more today. So thank you.
Thank you, Viviana. So, I mean, Viviana touched upon a lot of different types of challenges. So legal barriers to scaling up supply, pricing challenges in different countries with huge variations for supply, a lack of transparency around contracts, proprietary technology and not a lot of huge levels of technology transfers happening. And there's much to unpack, which we will. But she also talks about the importance of the TRIPS waiver proposal that's currently occupying a huge debate at the WTO. And I want to turn over to His Excellency Ambassador Navneet as a key co-sponsor of the TRIPS waiver proposal, and sort of South Africa, India, and many other governments championing this debate at the WTO. Could you tell us a little bit more of the TRIPS waiver proposal and why you see this as critical to the debate on vaccine access? And what are the ways forward in terms of making this a successful effort, and how the global community can come together to kind of expand manufacturing in countries to make them self-sufficient?
Thank you, Aruna. Good afternoon, distinguished speakers and organizers, for bringing us together on this very important and relevant topic today. So first, let me respond to the why part of the question. And it has been repeatedly asked that why this proposal has been moved. So I always start with this anecdotal thing that science has delivered, and whether WTO will deliver. And when I use this phrase, I reflect back and see the experience of last few epidemics during this pandemic. And in economic terms, if you see that it is, I use this phrase that, are we satisfied with single A rating, or we aspire to have a triple A rating? Now, single A is the availability part, and you add two more A's to it, that is accessibility and affordability. So I think this pandemic, global cooperation, it requires a triple A rating from all of us, all stakeholders. And that is the reason we started working on this proposal back last year in the month of July and August. That time we had experience of past few incidences during last decade, whether it was related to the treatment of HIV/AIDS, or it was the treatment of SARS or any other flu, which was coming repeatedly from different geographical locations. And we had the recent experience of March, April, May, and June, and here also in Geneva, that when we saw that in March, there was complete stock out of essential items relating to the COVID-19. I'm here referring to masks, sanitizers, and a lot of very basic things which were required to protect ourselves. And people staying here in Geneva would agree to that observation. And it was then that we started working on this proposal. And thanks to South Africa, and India joined South Africa in bringing up this proposal. This is one of those proposals where actually when your hypothesis or your presumptions are proved right, you actually feel sad. We are not elated that what we thought in August or September while designing this proposal, ultimately it proved right. And still we feel sad that it would have been better that if you would have been proved wrong in suggesting or giving those hypotheses or presumptions. And here I'm referring to, again, the accessibility and affordability part, because that time we had seen other products, but the vaccine was still under development. And it was not very sure that when it will come, but we by past experience, our presumption or our hypothesis was that we will have the same problem, which we have faced in past. And therefore, we must work on it so that at least WTO or any agreement, multilateral or bilateral agreement or regional agreement, should not come in the way of expediting the treatment or handling the pandemic in a more efficient and faster way. Now, 4 months down the line, when the first emergency use authorization has been given, that was in November, whatever we had written as the paraphrasing of that proposal or preamble of that proposal is coming true. And it is again, I'm repeating that we feel sad about it. The good part of it is in the last 4 or 5 months is that we had a lot of countries and members, very relevant questions, fine. They had all the rights to ask these questions for providing evidences because they felt that it is hypothetical thing. So again, we provided them all the answers for the questions raised. And only I see the good part of it is that now those who were asking the questions, that questioning the presumption of supply shortages itself, now at least we are on the same page, that everyone is agreeing that it's certainly a supply side issue. And I always, in my argument, I always used to say, and sometimes I had been mistaken also, that whether TRIPS agreement proposal is not in line with other initiatives, for example, the COVAX facilities of WHO, whereas our understanding was that it is only going to aid in fulfilling the objectives of COVAX or any other thing, because I strongly feel that COVAX, or for that matter, CTAP or accelerator, is kind of demand side intervention, that we were pooling the demand, we were going for financial closure of that demand, but we were not giving any answer to the supply side issue. And the TRIPS waiver proposal, therefore, was designed to answer the supply side issue. And now almost entire world is on the same page that that intervention required is on the supply side. Now, to augment supply, we need to see that all available tools should be used. So I would like to clarify here some of the, again, apprehensions raised that temporary waiver of certain provisions of TRIPS agreement is against multilateral law. No, it is not. Actually, we again, through this forum, I would like to convey that it is very much part of the multilateral agreement. And what South Africa and India started saying that the available tool in the Marrakesh agreement in Article 9, please start using that. Because if we don't use it in the case of a pandemic, then when will we use it? And again, I'm glad that the same sentence and same voice we are hearing from other forums and other institutions and higher dignitaries. So therefore, it is not correct to say that TRIPS agreement is against temporary waiver of TRIPS agreement is not against multilateral law or agreements. It is in fact using those provisions. And these are temporary in nature, targeted in nature, and proportionate. We are willing to discuss on the scope and text and duration of the proposal. Then, fourth thing I would like to clarify and explain to the private sector, because the working group is of business and human rights. Look, we have moved quite a lot in last 25 years. So branding the co-sponsors, which we are now 57 countries co-sponsoring this proposal and almost 100 countries explicitly supporting it, except 9 or 10 countries or blocks not coming forward or opposing it. So to private sector and business, here I would like to clarify that the co-sponsors, and India particularly, I can talk at least about India, that we are not against intellectual property rights. Problem here in Geneva is that most of the negotiators, they are having a legacy here and they have kind of personal memories. So when they were negotiating TRIPS agreement, let us say 15, 20, 25 years back, they had a kind of an image of developing countries, and they feel that they are always against intellectual property rights. But in the last 25 years, most of the co-sponsors, they themselves are having very robust and evolving framework on intellectual property. And India is one of the patent holder in vaccine itself. In the COVID vaccines, we have one of our own vaccines with patent. So here again, we want to clarify that we are not against intellectual property rights. And since we are talking about human rights, so if lockdown is imposed by authorities, then are we saying that those authorities are against right to freedom of movement or right to life, because it is linked to that? So I must say that temporary waiver of intellectual property rights is not against intellectual property rights, but it is a targeted and proportionate arrangement. And the same thing, it applies with the fiscal part of it. Lastly, 30 seconds, I don't have time. I think I can come back again on the economy part of it. and respond that how it is going to have your next question of way forward, that how it is going to have a win-win situation for the entire world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think it was great. We have to remember the triple A's. The TRIPS waiver supports the triple A of affordability, accessibility, and availability. There's lots in there again to hear about, what we can do to globally cooperate to make countries self-sufficient. But I do want to bring in Dr. Sima from the World Health Organization. This must be, the sort of the kind of situation that you'd never want to be in, or a sort of a nightmare to be handling a crisis globally of this kind of a proportion. But also it has been very poignant and powerful because the Director General came out in an op-ed in The Guardian, in favor of the TRIPS waiver proposal, saying, if not now, when? And so I'm curious to hear from you, what else is the World Health Organization doing or can do to support the TRIPS waiver proposal? And also a little bit more because, the World Health Organization has also set up the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. So also want to hear a bit more about that. And when we talk about states' obligations and their obligation to cooperate, like what are your ideas and recommendations for states to make the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool also a success? And what can they do to bring pharmaceutical companies to the Technology Access Pool to make it come alive? So the TRIPS waiver proposal, if you want to realize that, as well as this COVID-19 Technology Pool, your thoughts on states' obligations on both those fronts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aruna. Let me thank the South Center for the invite to be here today. It was great to hear you, Your Excellency, Ambassador, and Viviane. Good to see you. First, I want to talk a little bit about the moment that we are living through right now, right? Because I always joke, because I'm Brazilian and I've had like 40 years of public health. And when I talk to my friends in Brazil from medical school, they are all retired in living by the beach, and here we are trying to put some measures in place to help us end this acute phase of this pandemic. And I think a bit in line with the proposals that are going globally, we are saying that global solidarity is very good, but we need countries to think differently, and that global solidarity at this stage is also part of self-interest of countries, individual countries. Vaccine nationalism is tremendously deleterious for the control of the acute phase of this pandemic, right? It's not going to help any country that's trying to achieve right now to vaccinate healthy young adults, while other countries are still struggling to vaccinate the priority population. So we are saying, WHO and the DG has been saying very often the need for us to think of that no country is safe until every country is safe. No one is safe until everyone is safe. So we did put in place together with Gavi and CEPI the COVAX and the COVAX facility, which aim to level down a little bit the playing field. We start working with the allocation framework, and then we kind of have a soft approval of member states in September of an allocation mechanism that was aiming to reach up to 20% of the population, right? And because we at the time understood this was how many vaccines would be available, and also it's roughly the number of people who are at higher risk, right? Health workers, frontline workers, of course, plus people at higher risk of dying or of severe disease over 65 and people with comorbidities. Then we put in place an allocation mechanism, and the COVAX facility started to work and getting countries engaged in. And then we had these huge bilateral agreements coming into place, right? The US, of course, they always went on his own, but then you had the big bilateral agreement from the European Union also destabilizing the global supply. And the ambassador was saying about demand and supply. And I think we have a very different context right now when of course, we have a huge demand and a limited supply, right? And this is the world we live in. So that's what it is right now. Right? But did it have to happen the way it is happening now? We have right now, I think it's 46 countries that have received vaccines to the COVAX facility, vaccines from SII and from SK Bio, which is both are AstraZeneca vaccines. And we have 14 countries more that will receive by the end of this week. So this totals like 32 or 33 million doses, but 300 million, more than 300 million doses have been used already globally, right? And out of this, 70%, 76%, I think it's the latest figure, are concentrated in 10 countries and the majority in 3 countries only. You know, so we have this huge imbalance. And there are barriers to it. And we are saying the intellectual property is one of the barriers. It's not the only one, right? We have not stabilized the existing production capacity as it is. You know, we are seeing J&J coming into the market, was just emergency use listed by WHO, but it comes already into the market saying to the US and the European Union, they're going to deliver 50% of the doses that they contracted. We have AstraZeneca cut down 60% of what it was supposed to supply to Europe. So we have problems in the supply chain right now. The ambassador is aware we're struggling with the production of India, the SII in India to the developing countries. We're struggling to stabilize the agreement, the doses that were contracted will be delivered to the facility to be distributed for the April and May allocation. So we also have the unhelpful export restrictions and export bans that are going in many countries, right? So this is, when we're talking about the barriers, it's when I'm saying the IP is part of the barrier, but it's not the only barrier. It's important to consider, but we have, even on the supply chain, we have problems with the vials, right? And the stoppers, the glass vials and the stoppers. So there are many issues that need to be addressed and are being addressed. Dr. Tedros, the Director General, has been very supportive of the TRIPS waiver, but at the same time, we're trying to be very pragmatic as well, right? So we continue to push for the COVID technology access pool for CTAP to be functional, and this is coming to a point because where we are at the point where we are discussing what incentives would bring the industry to deposit licensing in CTAP on the medicines patent pool. Right? We are working already with a few Indian diagnostics companies, but we have a very harsh environment in the vaccine side. Right? I think and when I say we, I think everybody who works on intellectual property does not have a lot of experience on the IP barriers from the biologicals, from the vaccine specifically. Right? We have a lot of experience. Myself, I have personal experience on preparing the compulsory licensing of efavirenz, a small molecule in Brazil in 2006, but we are dealing with a different animal, the biologicals. So WHO right now has, besides the CTAP and the discussions with member states and with the companies and the colleagues from UNDP on this call, the UNDP is part of this together with others. We are thinking of what can make a difference this year. Okay, this year we are looking at what would be additional fill and finish capacity that could be available in the world, right? Because this year it's an issue of on the supply chain. You have some manufacturers that have the bulk, but they don't have the capacity to take this vaccine out. So we just had, for example, Johnson vaccine. J&J is doing a deal with Aspen to fill and finish, right? J&J is doing an agreement biological E from India that will include technology transfer, but in the first moment we understand is also fuel and finish. So there are things that have to be done, that could be done, not have to be done, but right now to increase to address some bottlenecks in the supply chain for us to be able to get to the end of the year with a better situation, especially and I'm not only saying developing countries, right? Because we have high-income countries who have a small market who are in the same situation as developing countries, right? So we are living at a moment where the countries that produce, be it India or Brazil or other countries that are not the high-income countries, if you have production capacity in your country, you're better off than, let's say, Finland or Norway, right? Because you are able to manage better this one. And then we have all the issues, and we are thinking also, and then you have new technologies like the messenger RNA, right? Where I think you will agree, because this is a reality, right? This is technology that's highly concentrated. I think Viviana mentioned this, but this is extremely highly concentrated right now on few companies in 2 countries, maybe in the world, right? And we think this technology will be useful for other vaccines, but it may be useful for other diseases as well. So there's a strong push from WHO to work to create this low and middle income countries technology hubs that would benefit from technology transfer for new platforms, right? Like the mRNA or others that may come, and that could help also for the monoclonal antibody, because we're talking about vaccines, but there are other biologics that may come, or small molecules that may come into place in terms of treating people, right? So we are at a very, very critical moment. You're seeing on the news now the issues concerned about safety with the AstraZeneca vaccine. And the truth is that all vaccines have side effects, right? Even if you have a rare event, which is 0.010% of all the vaccinations, when you vaccinate 100 million people, becomes a large number, right? So there are all these complex issues that now they need to be managed. Thinking of the short term, like I was mentioning on fuel and finish, the mid and long term, where intellectual property may play a role in the technology transfer, because we are also saying that technology transfer should use, the licensing agreement should use, for example, the medicines patent pool platform. WHO is a big defender of the voluntary licensing through the medicines patent pool, which you know has expanded its mandate to include COVID products. But I'll stop here because I think I spoke too much already. Apologies, everyone.
Not at all, Dr. Sima. I think you've given us, extremely good food for thought. Just to quickly recap on the COVID-19 technology access pool, Dr. Sima said, the current debate or where the thinking is that what kind of incentives do states have to offer? First of all, all states have to endorse it, and then what kind of incentives should you offer? And incentives and disincentives for pharmaceutical companies that don't participate in the COVID-19 technology access pool. And then, the initial capacity, the challenge is fill and finish, but we're also looking at revolutionary technology like mRNA, which is held by very few companies. There's not a whole lot of manufacturing capacity, which needs technology transfer. And it's not just important for COVID-19, but also other diseases. And so with that, it's a great segue, technology transfer. We're looking at the role of business here. I want to bring in Mr. Muqtadir from Bangladesh, who's the chairman of Incepta. Mr. Muqtadir, you represent, that side that has the capacity, that has the R&D and has the wherewithal to sort of manufacture. And you've recently said, you're able potentially to manufacture if there are technology transfers and if someone's willing to share their technology with you. So, love to bring you in on, what is the capacity in developing countries to scale up R&D and manufacture? And what should we do to tap into that? What needs to shift or change to make that happen and help developing countries more? Because the Gulf now is low and middle income countries not having the manufacturing capacity, as Dr. Sima said. There's an asymmetry in manufacturing capacity. So over to you.
Thank you, Aruna, and distinguished speakers. Good afternoon, good evening. And I'm really thankful to South Center for bringing us together and giving me this opportunity to speak in front of this wonderful gathering. First of all, that we have been trying very hard to convince the IP holders to let others use their intellectual property. Bangladesh is in a place which is LDC, and we are not obliged to implement IP. So actually, we are free to do if we can do anything. But in case of biologics and vaccine, it's a different ballgame altogether, which Dr. Mariangela was telling you. Let's say that we do not have any IP here in Bangladesh. So I want to make an mRNA vaccine, or let's say a vaccine from Oxford, or vaccine from which is coming, protein subunit vaccine. So what you have at this moment, almost several technological platform is already existing with us, and also in several other countries. And then let's say, can I make an mRNA vaccine, or adenovirus vaccine, or protein subunit vaccine? Probably yes. I can make an mRNA vaccine with the help of some universities. We have been working with Imperial College, and this is possible. But will that vaccine will get regulatory approval? The answer is no. We can make protein subunit vaccine, and this has been in the existence for very long time, like this hepatitis B vaccine that you take in, and we have a fantastic manufacturing platform existing both for fill finish as well as for antigen. But if I make that particular product, will I get a regulatory approval? The answer is a big no. Why? Because I have to once again go through a preclinical, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and now the kind of infection rate all over the place is so low. To prove its efficacy, it's a never-ending story. So that context, scientific context, you have to bring in first. So you have to put that scientific reality first, that even if we try, even if they forego all their IP rights and they do not cooperate with you, you would not be able to make a vaccine which is going to go and get regulatory approval. So what are the technological platform that has to be there, coordinated and very well balanced, and will have to be put into place in order to make these vaccines available? So organizations like WHO, CEPI, Gavi, FDA, UK MHRA, US government, they will have to think about it, and will have to take a very conscious decision that, okay, now we already have 4 vaccines approved, and probably few others are going to come in let's say 2 months' time. So then, are we going to get more vaccines approved? The answer would be extremely difficult to answer at this moment, because the disease rate, and there will be mixture of vaccinated people, non-vaccinated people, and then efficacy trial would be so complex. Maybe we have to be content with, let's say, half a dozen or 10 vaccines. Now, the question is, Viviana said that, okay, out of these vaccines, some of them, except probably Pfizer, all of them received taxpayers' money. So if the government wants, probably these vaccines and the technology can be made available for public good. And then another one thing, that innovation has to be rewarded. So like Mr. Nafnit says, that we are not against any intellectual property or intellectual rights, but at this moment, we need some kind of cooperation between ourselves, so that we have to think about what exactly we need to do to solve this problem. So this is something which came very suddenly. Everything happened in such a big so quickly, and everybody is in a kind of shock. When I talk to Moderna, when I talk to any other manufacturers, they actually do not have a time to think about anything else but to fulfill their already made commitments, because the government has paid them money, they are hammering on their head to deliver, and they are having hell of a lot of production problems to fix, and they cannot just raise their head and think anything else. So here, I think which organizations can actually help? I think what comes into my mind is WHO, CEPI, and of course, FDA and UK MHRA. So they have to think that, okay, we have to bring in the technology, the same seed, same clinical data that has been used in order to license this vaccine. We have to make a technological pool or patent pool or whatever you say in WHO's platform, that you have to make this technology, including their cell lines and manufacturing procedure. And the technology will have to be transferred to each recipient in the same way, so that the same vaccine is going to be manufactured and their clinical data is going to be used, and then these vaccines are going to be licensed all over the places. So that is the need at this moment. And now let's say any manufacturer who has the IP rights, this particular COVID time window is not forever. What we have seen earlier, that this coronavirus is going to mutate, and some point in time, they are not going to remain as lethal as it is today. So it might happen tomorrow, it might happen 2 months afterwards, might never happen. But there is every likelihood that when I talk to virologists, they say that it's going to happen. We do not know when. In earlier history, we have seen that it did not last very long. It is already going on more than a year. And I think any day, any time you will see some variant is not so virulent, but still they are causing infection. So if that happens, then this particular business model around this COVID-19 may not last forever. So the companies who have invested billions of dollars or millions of dollars, they are also very nervous to kind of recover their investment. So if we come forward, I think in the market, there is enough money to reward everybody. So here, I'm happy that Dr. Mariangela is here and listening, that they will have to propose and come forward. And I also would like to say, His Excellency Nafni, that the magnitude of the market, the number of products that needs to be produced are so huge that we can actually reward the innovators. If we are going to be able to assign a value, let's say $1 a dose, or 50 cents a dose, or $2 a dose, even that is possible in our collective effort to give it to them and make it absolutely open wherever, whatever manufacturing facilities there use it. There were certain constraints earlier for CEPI, Gavi, and WHO to select manufacturers because they wanted to have a WHO pre-qualified product. So only companies or only countries where there is a functional NRA existing, the companies can be shortlisted. But we have to come out of that. You would see, for example, I have a capacity sitting idle at this moment, 600 million doses a year in multiple dose. And there are 2 more lines also where I can do 2 dose or 5 dose, because if I get the change parts, then I can produce 1.2 billion doses a year. It is already existing, sitting idle, fill finish. And according to last week's WHO statement, that we need another additional 2.8 billion fill finish capacity to be arranged. So in Bangladesh, it is a wonderful facility. And I am also, for pharmaceutical, I'm also manufacturing pre-qualified products. So I'm aware about the quality management system. My products are going to Europe, to UKMHRA. My facilities are approved by UKMHRA pharma facility. But the vaccine facility, because the Bangladesh NRA is not functional, we cannot apply for pre-qualification. So that is why many companies who wanted to do these products, they are going to only those manufacturers where there is a functional NRA. So in this case, WHO will have to come out, because no vaccine as yet is normally a license, all of them under emergency. So WHO should come forward and give emergency approval to some of the NRAs or some of the manufacturers, go and manufacture the vaccine wherever it is possible. This is an extreme urgent period. So when we have been shouting this for almost like a year, and then we see that in some of the countries, they are vaccinating their whole population, but most of the countries even could not start their vaccination. It is a ground reality. So what is needed, identify wherever what manufacturing capacity is lying there, coordinate and involve FDA and UKMHRA, and make them absolutely clear quality guidelines so that the same product can be manufactured utilizing every single facility which is underutilized or non-utilized, not utilized globally. CEPI has done a wonderful work. It is already in their website, that there are how many companies are there, what capacity is there, what is lying idle, what is there. Everything is crystal clear. It's in the online. It is there in their website. Use this. As far as I know, that Incepta has a huge manufacturing capacity in terms of fill finish. Utilize this. And mRNA vaccine is something very interesting, because you don't need a huge space to make billions of doses. In a small vat, in a small capacity, you can make these doses. And there are also companies who can give you the lipids by which you have to envelop it. And then the only constraint is fill finish. Utilize the fill finish. I have -20 Celsius storage as well for millions of doses. So I can do this. I can volunteer my facility so that this can be done. Now, there are three other developments which are coming in, which we should pay attention to. One is Novavax is doing a protein subunit vaccine, where this is a conventional manufacturing procedure. This is plenty available all over the world. Use this particular facility for making the antigen, and then you fill finish it and go get going all over the world. This can be done. And then CureVac is coming in with 228 mRNA vaccine very soon. Talk to them and make this particular thing, and you can ask some of the European facilities to make the antigen and then do it fill finish or formulation all over the world. If you take the action now, then probably within 3 to 4 months time, you can immunize the whole world. I can tell you this much, there are possibilities. All you need to do is a little bit of innovation. Give them the reward that they want. Negotiate with them that if they do not come forward, their technology is not going to bring in any money after a certain period of time. Time is essence. If you have billions of tons of coal under your ground is not going to give you a single cent. The time is gone for the coal. Now it's for something else. So they have to realize, even though they made the innovation, it's not going to last forever. They have to come forward, utilize their technology. Then there is another one thing that is something very important, Dr. Simao mentioned, is monoclonal antibody. Eli Lilly, Regeneron, GSK, and GSK, they all have made wonderful monoclonal antibody. Because of the vagary of clinical trials and the nature of the disease, it took a very long time to prove that these products are important. These products are curative. I tell you, now we have diagnostic procedure, which is so fantastic that if you can identify early and give this monoclonal antibody, you can stop the death rate right away. And there are so many monoclonal antibody manufacturing platforms in the world. I have 4 lines. If I get only the cell line, I'll be able to deliver millions of doses. So please talk to them, get the cell line into the platform of WHO, distribute who can take it, give them the procedure, and give the regulatory approval and make it available throughout the world. If you can stop the death, this fear is going to go away and the whole world can open up. Then there is another one product, which is, I'm going to finish it, molnupiravir, which is a small chemical compound, a very wide spectrum antiviral drug. This is under development for the last 1 year. It should be expedited. Is under phase 3 now. It should come within the next month. If you pay attention to this, and if this can be brought in by May, forget it, this pandemic will become endemic by June. So please pay attention to these 3 or 4 proposals that I made. But it is not a problem, it can be solved, but we have to bring in the smartest mind of the world and work together. Money is there, reward those people who were the innovator, and I think it can be solvable. And I have a tremendous amount of capacity of 1.2 billion doses a year. I'd be more than happy to volunteer so that you can utilize my facility without thinking about anything. I mean, I'd be able to volunteer it, and I personally place this in front of you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Aruna, giving me this platform.
Thank you. And that is kind of a live example of someone saying, you know, I do have capacity, please use me. And kicking the ball back to Dr. Simao, it's going to come back to you with a tough question because the challenge has been primarily laid to you. And there are 2 themes I picked up on. One is kind of an ongoing need and demand for technology transfer, right? A sharing of clinical trial data, the challenge for the WHO to find an equivalence regulatory approval, the regulatory approval for equivalence in vaccines, which is the biggest challenge. So coming back to you, Dr. Simao, because you're a part of 2 initiatives. One is the COVAX and then the COVID-19 Technology Access Pool. And Mr. Muqtadir here sort of made this pitch about, we need sharing. We need to identify those who are willing, and we need to find those who have the technology to reward them and incentivize and bring it and disseminate it with an agreed upon regulatory approval. So we're not stuck without regulatory approval, even after something's manufactured. So yes, I mean, back to you, Dr. Simao, like your thoughts on how can we make this real? Like it's all back to you. How can we bring together this, it's not magic, but it can happen. What is your big takeaway for states? Like if we were to go organizations like South Center, Human Rights Watch, Third World Network, MSF, Public Citizen, lots of us are trying to put our heads together, really sort of working towards this. And the huge, big alliance called the People's Vaccine Alliance, that's also really pushing for all of these things. Everybody's on the same side. How can we make technology sharing happen? Please give us your biggest thought, what we can do.
Well, first of all, let me thank Dr. Abdul, the very interesting inputs and some food for thought for sure, in the regulatory challenges, and specifically we have been pressed to to address the issues of the requirements for the monoclonal antibodies, for example, right, and biosimilars. So these are things that we are treating with care, right? Because at one side, you need to ensure there is a quality assurance system in place, right? Because there's all kinds of manufacturers out there. But at the same time, we also need to make sure that there is increased capacity, because we know that generic production, increased competition decreases price. So it's a balance between the two, right? Because we do need to, and it's right now, it's the main agenda. I mean, the main topic on the news this week is the safety concerns that are, we don't think they are related, but a lot of trust on the products depends on us having a robust, transparent quality assurance norms and standards for quality assurance. So that's something that we need to be very careful. We don't want to ask too much, but we need to have the systems in place to ensure that a vaccine, for example, right now, we are not only assessing for emergency use listing the vaccines that are produced by multinational companies, right? We are assessing the Chinese vaccines, we are assessing of course, we already did an emergency use listing for SII. We are working with Bharat right now to ensure that they just finished phase 3 trial, that they come to for the emergency use listing by WHO. So this is a huge work in progress, but we very much welcome the discussion. WHO now I think has 14 expressions of interest of vaccine manufacturers, but it has to start with the vaccine manufacturer, right? Because WHO puts out the call, and then it's not mandatory that anyone comes with the vaccine proposal to WHO, but any vaccine that's on phase 2B or phase 3 can start a rolling submission for the emergency use listing. I think also, Aruna, because we are not, this pandemic is the most impactful of our generation, my generation for sure, maybe not for the younger people here, but we have some lessons learned because we faced other pandemics, right? And there is a construct that was put in place for the influenza pandemic, right? And that is where we are using right now to rethink how to because we have to learn from the past why some things did not work in the influenza pandemic, because all these issues were discussed as fill and finish, the technology transfer hubs, and the bilateral and multilateral agreements. They were, this is not new. We did that 10 years ago, or more than 10 years ago, with the pandemic, the influenza. So the trick right now is that we don't do the same mistakes, because we are talking about addressing the needs of this pandemic, because we're living through it. It's not going to be over anytime soon, but also to set the ground. And I think, Dr. Mukherjee, you really did put some things on the table, set the ground for us to have capacity to deal with new pathogens, because they will come, right? And this is one of the questions that I made to colleagues who have experienced the pandemic, the influenza pandemic, on the technology hubs, right? What went wrong? Because apparently there are only 2 or 3 places that still function from that time, right? And they had, I think, 14 hubs. And one thing is the political commitment, right? Because over time, if you take 10 years to come a new pandemic, politicians forget about it, and we saw that this time, right? We saw that even rich countries were not prepared for this pandemic, right? No one was prepared, because you move ahead. The second point that's lessons learned, and I'm bringing this to your attention as well, because I think it's good as you think forward, the self-centered, other think tanks that are participating on this discussion today. The other thing is to ensure long-term sustainability, right? Because it gets to a point where local production is maybe more expensive than what you're paying in the international market, right? So that we need to have systems in place when you Dr. Abdul was talking about, we need to not only to have the incentives in place, but they need to be sustainable long term. And this needs to be ready for it needs to be considered as we set up what we think the future will look like. And then the discussion on the waiver helps because it puts it maybe many countries are not happy with it and many partners are not happy with it, but it's putting right on the table the issues for discussion. Let's see how it evolves, but this is, and Dr. Tedros says, if it's not here, when? And then we also say, we complement, because if we don't set up we don't address some issues now, we need to be pragmatic. We need to address issues now. But if we don't set up the how do you say in English, to level the discussion, we don't set up some concrete steps, and addressing intellectual property barriers could be one. Right? In 2 years' time, we're discussing the same thing because we haven't progressed. So we need to think of the steps that will take us to a progressive approach to increase access to medicines and health products that are global goods. I'll stop here and apologize, I spoke too much. And I also need to apologize in advance because I'll need to leave a little bit earlier than the panel, as the panel continues.
Thank you so much. That has been really helpful, and thank you for joining us. And I'm going to pick up on something Dr. Simal said about regional hubs for manufacturing, long-term sustainability, and I want him to bring back in His Excellency Vijayendra Navneet. I mean, how can we use again the proposal at the WTO, the role of the WTO, like you said, the science has shown the way, will WTO show the way, and make the way and create the space. Two questions for you. How can we use the opportunity and momentum around the waiver proposal to push some of this long-term proposals that Dr. Simal is talking about in terms of, decentralizing and making manufacturing more regional, so that there are hubs which make countries self-sufficient in the longer term? The first question. And the second question is, from your perspective, because there has been previously a high-level panel, a UN high-level panel that specifically looked at, some of the trade-based retaliation and intimidation of countries that try to use TRIPS flexibilities. And how can we make sure that what is the role of human rights organizations and civil society in sort of reporting and monitoring back against the, any kind of trade-based retaliation, and where would you say UN special procedures can help on this front? So that's the second question, because we're also sitting in the business and human rights sort of forum. And a related question is, what would you say to pharmaceutical companies, especially who are lobbying for the use of listing countries and pharma industry, sort of specifically where, even where countries are just sort of supporting the waiver or, indicating that they may use flexibility. So the three questions for you.
Thanks, Aruna. And I am not enthusiastic by the conversation what we are listening to for last 1 hour. Let me be very blunt on this, because we hear the same argument again and again. And unfortunately, in this panel also, we are hearing the same argument. And Mr. Muqtadir himself has brought out the contradiction in the argument that he is committing that, yes, there is capacity produced, but there is something coming in the way, which is not allowing 1.2 billion doses to come in the market. So therefore saying that it is not, IP, we never said that IP is the only issue, but yes, IP is one of the issue. So if we are not willing to handle this and allow one of the tool available to work, and let me bring out this dichotomy in this argument, which I hear from two panelists and which I hear from the other sides always, that look, there will not be addition in capacity, even if you waive IP, which has been said by one of the panelists here also. And then at the same time, we hear, and I can see the question in the question box also, that if you waive the IP rights for temporary period, it will have tremendous impact on the commercial interests of IP rights holders and future innovation. So this is a clear that you take this side also, and you cannot argue on both the sides. If you are agreeing that waiving of trips for certain period is going to not to augment supply, not to increase production, then not talk about the loss in the commercial interest of IP rights holder. But if you are agreeing that yes, it is going to increase the production capacity or the supply chain, then don't say that we are not going to use this as a tool because it is going to hamper the future. So here the issue is of short-term, medium-term, and long-term interventions. And we never said that there should not be compensation for innovations. In fact, in the beginning also, I said that when I will touch upon the economy part, I will answer that how it can be the remuneration package can be designed, where by any given analysis that if you use 10 billion doses, you put any price, 2 billion, 3 billion. And now we have that Boston University paper, which puts 35 to 40 billion for 5 IP rights holder. And compare that 35 to 40 billion dollars with $9 trillion loss of output and $13 trillion worth of fiscal and monetary stimulus given worldwide. So where are we heading? We are just arguing this, and if moral suasion, which is being proposed again and again, because voluntary license is nothing but moral suasion, what you are talking about here. So if moral suasion is going to work, it would have worked in October, November, December, January, and February. So I am not coming in the way of moral suasion, pushing for voluntary license. Third way, as proposed by our DG in WTO, every effort is welcome. Every effort adding even a single dose of vaccine availability or therapeutics availability is welcome. But don't put it as either or, which was there earlier the case with COVAX and CTAP and accelerator. Now at least either or has gone. So please don't bring it again that the TRIPS waiver is not going to add to the capacity. And let me clarify here, there are more learned people here in the panel on the process and the efficacy part. IP rights or no rights, the process for approval for the domestic regulators are not different. They will not compromise on the efficacy and safety of the product. So saying that it will not be available, fine, it will not be available till regulator approves. Then that process has to start. Imagine that if the phase 1, phase 2 would have started in November itself, if this proposal would have been clear, then you would have had added a lot of capacity and a lot of applications to domestic regulators as well as WHO. So we are not in a theoretical world here. What I hear mostly is the theoretical arguments, but here we are facing the situation daily, and every quarter we are losing millions of lives. When the proposal came, the loss of life was 1 million. Today you mentioned 2.6 million. So when we are discussing, the number has more than doubled. And every quarter we are losing trillions of dollars of output. And let me, on the rights of business, is it so sacrosanct to just talk about 5 or 6 innovators in the world? What about the innovation? What about the capital deployed in other sectors of economy? When we close aviation sectors, when we close hospitality sector, when we close tourism, when we closed a lot of MISMEs, they were not having innovations. Are we not prioritizing their innovations? So this putting again, it's a very convenient wall to put that innovation and you are against innovation. I am saying innovation is certainly necessary for society. Innovation certainly should be remunerated, but then there should be a way out of remuneration and sectors should get equal treatment. We are giving one sector a very biased kind of treatment, and not only one sector. Within that sector, you have only few products on which we are talking about innovation and totally ignoring the innovation or potential rights of other products and other sectors of the economy. And they provide a lot of livelihoods, they bring a lot of things into how long our healthcare workers will keep on fighting this battle. How long the nurses, how long the frontline workers will keep on fighting when the treatment is inside, treatment is available, but it is not being provided. So here I will refer to India's that vaccine mastery approach, that the first priority we gave was to healthcare workers, frontline workers, and it was about, let us say, in Indian parlance, it was 3 crore, which is a 30 million, and is about 2%, 2.5% of population. So if everyone would have agreed, if WHO kind of organization would have made this happen, that yes, countries will come together and provide 3% of the population, which is healthcare or frontline workers, we would have completed everything by now. In our second phase, we have moved to comorbidity and senior citizens, providing about 300 million, covering about 300 million people, which is slightly less than 25% of the population. It is going in line with the WHO 20% COVAX kind of facilities. And then if India as a producer, and I will touch upon what WTO can do, is again, export restrictions is criticized left, right, and center. But here I want to bring out another aspects of export restrictions. See, India, we have provided to 71 countries Indian manufactured vaccines in the hour of crisis when we are short of vaccines. 71 countries, almost 60 million doses, 200,000 doses for UN peacekeeping forces. Now, you compare that with other parts of the world, that how much has gone out and how much has been used domestically. So export restriction is a dual tool. If it is in good hand, you can actually have totally aligned with your heading of your session, that equitable access to COVID vaccine. A country can use export restriction to provide equitable access. And at the same time, a country can use export restriction to do just a stock holding or hoarding in their own countries. So it's not that the export restriction as a tool, and we have shown it during last 9 or 10 months in everything, in medicine, masks, PPE kits, and everything, including now vaccine, that if you use export restrictions judiciously, not like a theoretical thing that export restriction is good or bad, it can actually deliver equitable access. Otherwise, all big pockets, if you remove export restrictions, all big pockets, if it will go only by bidding, and then the highest bidder will get all the supplies. And we certainly don't want that situation to come in. Regional hub, India is willing to further augment, and we are already on the, through different channels, we are doing that to augment supply and augment our production capacity. And that should be the way out, that we should have regional manufacturing and collaboration for future. It should be again taken it up as a medium term, how to design the incentive to innovators and the manufacturers, so that in any sort of crisis, we have that kind of supply available. Pharma lobby, I can only say that pharma sectors, that see your requirement, WHO can always design a remuneration thing which will cover $30 to $40 billion commitment for next 5 years or 6 years, something like that, because it is nothing compared to trillions of dollars of fiscal stimulus being given, and it helps both sides, developing as well as developed, because ultimately you may provide a stimulus, but it has an impact going forward in 2-3 years' time on the inflation side, on the debt sustainability side of so many countries. So we don't want these agencies to become bankrupt or something like that due to debt, this thing. So my point is that don't say that we are just removing intellectual property rights. We are here to design a remuneration which is adequately incentivizing innovation and giving them their money back. And this marathon, that development of vaccine, was a marathon and was done as kind of a sprint. And it was thanks to the regulatory forbearance and public funding. Otherwise, if IP right is the only incentive for development of a vaccine, we should have seen so many vaccines being developed in last 25 years. Why it takes 7, 8, or 10 years to develop? So that means certainly something different has been done in last 10 months. And that brings out that how coordination and cooperation can be done between public and private. So don't feel threatened that this proposal will take away all the innovations and all R&D. We are here to protect innovation. We are here to incentivize innovation, but we should not come in the way of supply augmentation. That is my final point. Thank you.
Thank you. So that was a very good sort of summation. One is sort of the TRIPS waiver balances the needs of multiple sectors. It's a way to look at not just the pharma sector and just one section of the huge pharmaceutical potential in the world. We need to scale up. we need to balance the concerns of different sectors that are also taking huge economic losses and also are innovators in their own right in different capacities. And then I want to open up the floor for questions. And I think Professor Suryadeva had a question for the panel, and I'm going to hand it over to Professor Suryadeva.
Thank you very much, Aruna, and thank you all the distinguished panelists. It was very interesting to hear different perspectives and all that. I mean, my only question is very simple, which I already put in the chat box. So my perspective is coming from the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So the point is that when states are negotiating in multilateral settings, whether this is WTO or something else, WHO, they have to be taking cognizance of their human rights obligations as well. So if certain developed countries who are supporting UN guiding principles, they take this stand that this temporary waiver is not consistent, or we should not be going for it, how does it reconcile with their commitment under principle 10A? And the text is already put in the chat box, because that is very clear that these multilateral institutions should not hamper the ability of the states to protect human rights. They should also not hamper the ability of businesses to respect human rights, because businesses, even pharma companies, those who are manufacturing these vaccines, they have a responsibility to respect all human rights, including the right to health, right to life. So how do we bring this issue from a business and human rights perspective to the debate? And that is a question for anyone in the panel. Thank you very much.
Maybe I'll give Viviana a chance to answer, and then anybody else who will want to offer.
Sure. Thank you, Aruna. Mina, I think that's a great question. It brings us back to the issue that we're talking about a very specific sector. So we're not talking about a general business. We are talking about how to address public health. And this is about lives of people. And there is a number of different rights, but we need to, in this area, give priority to public health. And that is also then correctly related to the human rights framework, and that should be the priority. Then we have a whole set of multiple rules, from trade rules to investment and others. But unfortunately, those rules, instead of aiding us fully, we're finding that we are carrying them through strongly in a way that is hampering our ability to give a full public health response backed by our obligations on the human rights side. So that is really what we're seeing, is that we need to put at the forefront these human rights and public health issues first, and resolve the issues from the trade and investment and other frameworks. And I think that was very much well explained in the reality of how it's functioning by Ambassador Namdeet already. I'll stop there. Thank you.
I also have a question, perhaps for anybody else who can answer this. I mean, what do we do in terms of making sure that the pharma industry cooperates a little bit more and sort of takes into cognizance, like Professor Suryadeva was saying, about their human rights responsibilities? Because while states have the primary responsibility to negotiate, the TRIPS waiver and support it and put in place the global policy framework necessary, the pharma industry also has a responsibility, and companies have a responsibility to align their overall operations with human rights responsibilities and conduct effective. In terms of what they should do is not interfere with states' exercise of, for example, TRIPS flexibilities. And how can we sort of bring more awareness around this, or call it out, help the pharmaceutical industry understand the urgency of this, how that's not aligned with their responsibility? Any ideas on what more we need to do? I'm going to hand it over to Ambassador Navneet.
My response to this question is more on economic terms. I don't want to convey that this proposal or expanding the capacity is going in the way of the economic interest. I have put out those numbers very clearly that if you look at, everyone is talking about, let us say 10 billion doses, if we assume that 2 doses are required. And it is going to be, as of now, though, there is one version that it may happen that in June we will be out of this pandemic, but majority thinks that it will be kind of a regular flu shot going forward in next 3 to 4 or 5 years, something like that. So even if I take a 5 years horizon, that then we will have a different sort of mutation and we will be coming out of this pandemic. 10 billion into, let us put some value of 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever you want to do that. I repeatedly say that it is something of the order of, let us say, 30 to 40 billion dollars, which is the commercial value of that product. Even if I assume that 90% of the commercial value is the profit for R&D and innovation, which in general case, generally it is there. So we are talking something of 30 to 35 billion dollars. Now compare it with the fiscal stimulus which countries have provided. It has already reached $10 trillion. So can't we have a design where the pooling can take place rather than demand pooling and financing it? Some sort of buying out or sharing that rights so that capacity like what Mr. Muqtadir has mentioned can be availed, WHO buying out those rights or any other organization buying out those rights and then moving ahead, which is a commitment only of 30 to 40 billion dollars for the next 3, 4, 5 years. It is not even 0.1% of the money put on table for coming out of the pandemic. So are we unnecessarily trying to create a barrier and trying to deviate this discussion into this category that equity? I'm saying fine, equity is fine, but even it doesn't make any economic sense to lose out on trillions of dollars of world GDP, WTO, which is responsible for global trade, to lose out on trillions of dollars of global trade and not work on something which can be done in 0.01% of the total cost. So I am yet to hear a response on this argument. Here in the chat box, one question has been mentioned that what about future innovation? We can design something like that, where you can always incentivize innovation by pooling and then give it to the right candidate, because ultimately innovation is taking risk. And those successful, they are getting those compensation based on their market value. So I don't see it as coming in the way of the commercial interest of IP rights holder and scaling up production. I think we have gone wrong, slightly wrong on the approach during last 7, 8, 9 months. If we would have started in last May, June on this basis, that we will have temporary waiver, we will have adequate remuneration, we will ask countries to contribute into that, and we will design something to compensate those IP rights holder, but we will ensure that 10 billion doses, whenever the product is available, 10 billion doses are available within 1 or 2 quarters. I think we would have moved ahead. I will stop at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Navneet. I think, we're close to our time here, and I do want to give an opportunity to Professor Suryadeva for some closing comments, but that's a fantastic summation. Just to summarize, we have to throw our weight, all countries, once again, to throw our weight behind the TRIPS waiver proposal. The cost to the world in terms of sheer numbers of deaths, people affected by disease, the damage and being done to economies is huge. The number of industries being affected economically is massive, and what it's going to cost to support the TRIPS waiver and facilitate the widespread sharing of technology and any potential loss, commercial losses, so-called losses that pharmaceutical industry may suffer, can be remunerated. It's in terms of looking at the obligations of governments, we really want governments to cooperate and come together and develop a framework of collaboration where they can put on the table a proposal for fair remuneration for companies that are willing to share and incentivize that kind of sharing while simultaneously supporting the TRIPS waiver, because the two enable each other. And I want to, and thank you for all the panelists and the questions, but I also want to give Professor Suryadeva the final closing comments before we sign off.
Thank you very much, Aruna. And let me also thank the South Center and the Human Rights Watch to collaborate with the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And I hope this discussion exposed certain different dimensions. And I think we need to discuss more dimensions. And I would say we did not discuss enough the responsibility of businesses, because they have an independent responsibility. What Ambassador Navneet was talking about, of course, states have to play that role and collectively they should work together. But irrespective of what states are doing or not doing, under the UN guiding principles, businesses, even those who are manufacturing and innovating these vaccines, they have an independent responsibility to conduct human rights due diligence and consider the impact on right to health, right to life. And I think this is also potentially going to become a discrimination issue. People who are vaccinated and who are not. And those who are not vaccinated, they may be getting discriminated on a number of grounds. Their access to certain facilities may be limited. Their right to travel may be limited. So I think there are significant implications. And I think the way forward is for states, businesses, and international organizations to work together to create a balanced solution which can work for all of us. Because that is the message of SDGs, leaving no one behind. And the current system is leaving definitely billions of people behind in getting access to vaccines. So with that, thank you once again, everyone. And let us continue this conversation in different forms. Back to you, Aruna, if you want to say anything more. Thank you.
No, I just want to thank all of the panelists and the UN South Asia Forum for Business and Human Rights for giving us this opportunity for a very rich discussion. I also want to thank Dr. Simao, Viviana, His Excellency Brajendra Navneet, Mr. Muqtadir, all of you for joining this debate. Thank you so much. And we hope this discussion was a fruitful one.